Good morning. My name is Elly Papamichail. I'm an anthropologist and I hold a master's on language education for refugees and migrants from the Hellenic Open University. I'm working on my PhD in social anthropology on the Greek diaspora in Africa through an autoethnographic lens. I'm an independent researcher currently working with Michael Harkin on the intellectual biography of Prince Peter, Greece's first anthropologist. My presentation today is on searching for belonging in an uncertain world. Can refugees as occupants of a liminal space experience belonging? I will be looking at refuginess as a liminal state, even when it becomes permanent. I will look at how refugee camps constitute non-spaces as they lack the organic character distinctive of a community, how time relates to migration, and how waiting affects refugees, entailing shame. Taking into consideration the idea of other as justification for the marginalization of refugees, I will examine whether a temporary community can constitute a context of stability and provide belonging. Finally, I will examine the meaning of heritage within permanent liminality and offer the example of the Melissa Network for migrant women in Greece that promotes empowerment, communication, and active citizenship. Liminality as a term derives from the Latin limen, which means threshold, and it was coined in 1908 by Arnold van Gennep in regard to the rites of passage, which consists of three major stages: that of separation from the previous context of belonging, that of transition or liminality, also referred to as threshold, and that of incorporation to the individual's new status. Within liminality, a person undergoing a ritual is standing at a threshold of her previous life or status and has not yet entered her new status. Liminality is a temporal and in-between state, one from which participants of a ritual expect to emerge and move on to the third stage of incorporation. Liminality is an out-of-time and out-of-space context which applies to the transitional state of refugees. Victor Turner associated liminality with a dismantling of all past or traditional institutions, while later Zygmunt Bauman widened the use of the term liminality and included it in the social sciences in general. Other scholars, such as Agnes Horvath, Bjorn Thomasson, and Harold Wydra, suggested that it is a dynamic tool that examines a variety of challenges at the crossroad of anthropology and political studies, as well as in diverse fields such as international relations, literature, education, the arts, and popular culture. They noted that liminality must be studied in its own right, as experiences constitute contexts of transformation, focusing on the abrupt eruptions of existential crisis which people face as they lose meaning. There are cases that liminal situations replace normalcy with what Victor Turner refers to as life in the conditional. The limits is a state in which anything can take place that can change a person's existential core. All possibilities are open once the former certainties no longer exist and one passes in a state that is sensitive, flexible, and uncertain. Turner emphasized that the middle phase of the ritual was a mimetic enactment of a crisis. In fact, transformations in the contemporary world can be understood through liminality, a process that looms particularly important within the uncertainties caused by globalization and modernity, and which trigger any form of separateness and antagonisms. Indeed, as crises through the world escalate, new models are required to address the complex dimensions of these crises. Liminal periods can be defined by entire collapse of order. Thus, the solutions of order need to be considered. During crisis, entire societies can experience liminality. The temporal dimension of liminality can range from moments to centuries, an example of which is modernity, which is suggested to constitute a peculiar type of permanent liminality. As Thomason says, longer periods and even entire epochs can be considered liminal. Michel Hage says that a long moment of uncertainty has settled in the world. Directly linked to the idea of permanent liminality is that of permanent mobility, as people are becoming increasingly used to a massive mobility of unknown direction. Contrary to the words of Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian poet, who states that when in a foreign land, we must choose a northerly direction, following the wind, we now find ourselves in a world in which the wind keeps changing direction while we discover that we are, in fact, living on the wind. We have to know who we are without having a definite anchorage, neither here nor there, as Hage says. Borders and thresholds have become accepted facts of our lives, effectively defining our relationship with the other as a representative of another culture or race. The construction of otherness seems to find fertile ground in refugees, as refugees are presented as others within a justification of exclusion, marginalization, and banishment. Michael Ignatieff makes the connection of how refugees are presented as others, thus how populist politics other the stranger, the refugee. Relationship with the other reaches the extreme of outright segregation just before their final rejection and disappearance. Within the niche of the modern world that has been ideologically constructed on ideas of westernization, modernization, technological advancement, and individualism, refugeeness and all the anguish and misery it entails is justified as a deserved status of the other, of human entities perceived as outsiders by definition, and even as agents of contamination, thus ideologically justifying their marginal positionality and even indifference to their suffering and death. Moreover, terrorist attacks construct an anxiety background that feeds into the projection of refugees as a threat, as a potentially evil other. Refugees residing in refugee camps are in a state of social liminality that is subtle and voiceless, as they are out of place, a sense that is reinforced by the political aspect of border liminality, that of existing what Hage refers to as outside the boundary of the common law, without papers, in a space designated as a waiting zone. When exploring liminality, it is important to look at Ghassan Hage's term of stckedness, which is the opposite of what he refers to as existential mobility, a form of imaginary mobility that is essential for a viable life. Hage puts forward the idea that the current socio-historical conditions of permanent crisis have engendered a generalized and magnified feeling of stckedness in crisis, a test in endurance. Hage refers to people opting to stick it out in times of crisis rather than to confront it and work towards change. Indeed, Hage focuses on waiting out as a mode of dealing with crisis. When people migrate, he says, they are seeking existential mobility, thus an environment that gives them a sense that they are going somewhere rather than nowhere. Migration is the physical expression of feeling unable or unwilling to wait out the crisis, which contrasts stckedness. Looking at the stckedness of the established white cultural milieu, which is usually activated by the widespread job tenure insecurity caused by globalization, he encounters what he termed as the heroism of the stuck. Within such social conditions, resilience and endurance, being able to wait out the stuckedness until mobility is again resumed, are the qualities celebrated. Hage states that the heroism of being stuck is encapsulated in the very notion that it implied by endurance, asserting some agency over the very fact that one has no agency, not giving up, not becoming a victim, despite the forces exerted. The celebration of survival has become a generalized cultural form worldwide and has resulted in an equally generalized sympathy for the victim or the underdog, creating out of the waiting behavioral mode a sense of community. This community of the stuck, expressed by the established white, exhibits resentment towards the mobile immigrant. The migrants stand out from the community of the stuck through the perceived unwillingness to wait out the crisis like the rest of us. According to Sartre and Badiou, crisis is an unusual state that brings upheaval and change, and as such results in a reassessment of the social order, waiting out, and the emergence of a force of revolt, no more waiting. However, Hage argues that in today's perspective, crisis is no longer unusual. Instead, it approximates normalcy, having become a permanent state of exception. Thus, endurance in the face of crisis is the hallmark of the good citizen, the civilized response of getting stuck in a classy way, as opposed to the lower classes, the uncivilized, who are perceived as running amok in the face of crisis, are vulgar and impatient, unable to wait properly. However, as refugees wait on the sideline of society for the opportunity to belong, they experience shame. As Marie Pardy says, multiculturalism can be perceived as a waiting room where one has to endure both the waiting and the wanting to belong. This often prolonged wait in the process of belonging, imposed on the poor and powerless, instead of enhancing feelings of optimism, becomes a source of torment, leading to a distressing feeling of shame. It is this sense of shame, in fact, which reinforces the need to go on waiting. This recurring cycle of shame, waiting, reveals both the yearning and the disappointment associated with the migrants' and the refugees' wish to belong. Although the end of shame marks the arrival of belonging, the experience of waiting is unendurable. Waiting, as mentioned by Bergson, relates to time having two temporalities, time thought and time lived. As they embody the wait, migrants feel like waiting for life to begin. Thus, the shame of waiting is transformed into anger. As Shahram Khosravi says, in modern societies, people approach time in terms of how it can most efficiently be used. Time, says Khosravi, is associated with success and money. Hence, waiting symbolizes waste, emptiness, and uselessness. Time is perceived as broken. A place defined by waiting is refugee camps, which are sites that welcome the human fallout of crisis that occur in different parts of the world. Refugee camps fall in the category of what Marc Auger defines as non-spaces, as there are spatial contexts occupied by people in transit, designed to be lived in for a short period. Yet, this temporality often becomes permanent, retaining, nevertheless, the characteristics of liminality. Being liminal, non-spaces are also contexts of uncertainty. There is movement, but also obstruction from movement, and as such, people are often trapped in non-spaces. Their very existence thus represents for these people an actual as well as a symbolic transition from one society to another. It is a place in between. The period of time spent in the camp is considered to be the opportunity for refugees to be transformed into entities able to succeed in their host country. However, unlike participants of a ritual who, as neophytes, comply to the authority of the community during the process of a ritual transition, in the context of a refugee camp, people respond to authority that is completely outside their own community. Thus, in the case of refugees, the term rite of passage signifies a series of symbolic actions created by the international community aimed at transforming refugees into people that can eventually become part of a host society and thus be incorporated in it. Mortland maintains that the state of liminality in refugee camps is maintained because of the conditions experienced by those confined within: separation from homeland, unfamiliar surroundings, uncertain future. All these parameters create feelings of anxiety and tirelessness that persist for as long as the refugees stay in the camps, whereas Kuhn says they feel they are in a no man's land of midway to nowhere. Refugee camps become spaces of useless souls, like the lepers of medieval times, placed outside the city wall, says Hage. A binary opposite of a non-place, such as a refugee camp, is a community, a word which Bauman says has a feel, as it connotes an idea and concept that feels good. It is warm, cozy, and comfortable. It thus constitutes an antithesis to what is out there in the street, conveying the juxtaposition between closed and protected versus open and dangerous. This binary opposition between closed and open has long been studied within anthropological discourse in regard to space. For example, the classic dichotomy between public and private space. The meaning and cultural significance of these binary spatial contexts. The time we live are ruthless, and it is precisely in a world in which all else is moving and shifting that trust and security are absent. Thus, people are seeking for a community in which they can belong. Community constitutes what we miss in these turbulent times, what we hope to return to. Bowen suggested it is another name for paradise lost. Yet community may constitute what we imagine, as perhaps we never actually experienced belonging in a community. The notion of community is directly linked to belonging. The two cannot exist apart. Belonging to a certain place suggests the idea of loyalty to a place, which can be articulated through oral or written histories, narratives of origin, as well as rituals. Belonging is also a way of remembering, which is defining in the construction of collective memory that concerns a place. Moreover, belonging, which connotes a potential of connecting people to place and social relationship, also brings up emotions of longing to be at a particular place, whether real or imaginary. Having examined the topic of belonging in an uncertain world, and particularly refugees as a liminal state, how refugee camps constitute non-spaces, and how time is experienced as broken, while waiting engenders shame, the question of whether refugees as occupants of a liminal space can experience belonging looms as a paradox. However, there are cases that show how refugees can experience belonging as occupants of a liminal space, and one such example is the Melissa Network in Athens, Greece, which has been founded on the idea to provide a community and a safe place to women refugees. The foundation of the organization was at the end of 2014, but the actual opening happened in July 2015, which is when the big influx of refugees began. It was a temporal and spatial coincidence. The idea, says Dr. Nadina Christopoulou, one of the founders, was to capture the transitory moment within a passing and transitory space, to create a home away from home. And that home would inevitably have to be a transitory liminal notion of home. Many metaphors are used to describe Melissa. One is that it is the first solid ground underneath their feet, and referring to the refugee women, it is a wall to lean on. It is a space where they can catch their breath, reclaim their hope and desire for the future, start reestablishing a sense of orientation and thinking about finding a new pace and a new life and a new place. Melissa does constitute a community, even if temporary, for women who stay for a short while and then leave. Yet the idea of Melissa stays with them, just as a stable community would. In fact, when the borders were open and refugees could still leave Greece to go further up north, there were cases of refugee women who actually returned to Greece and to Melissa, as they did not find the feeling of community in their target countries, such as Germany and Sweden. Melissa was constructed within a context of liminality and on spatial grounds of liminality at Victoria Square, which has always been a liminal space because it housed layers and layers of history in many ways, including Melissa's very building, actually, as Nadina tells us. Greek expats and Greeks returning from the various homelands around the world where they had their flats, apartments, people from Alexandria, Cairo, Istanbul, Greeks from Russia. Victoria Square and Melissa became the destination for people pouring from anywhere, from Tehran to Kabul to Aleppo. They became a reference point, a meeting place of transit populations. They became keywords, symbols of survival, ithakas. It is this reference point that constitutes the context of heritage for the women refugees who experience belonging in the Melissa community within their liminal and transit state. Women of all ages and from various backgrounds empower one another in ways that reflect their own heritage as they create a vivid tapestry of memories, their legacy for generations to come. I caught a glimpse of that as an adolescent girl needed to alter her dress she would wear that evening. A refugee woman from Africa stepped in, took the dress, and modified it on the spot. This is what happens in community, and this is what happens in Melissa. Thank you for your attention.